Hey, welcome to Real Estate Resource. Thanks for stopping by. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. I really hope you enjoy this video. So we'll go ahead and get started. Again, I'm back. Sorry it took so long to get back to having contract class, but I'm happy to be back here with you guys. Today we're going to talk about some of, not all of, the forms that were added in June of this year, and some of the ones that were changed. So I really want to focus on the ones that are probably the most likely that you guys are going to use, because a lot of them were property management and things to do with landlords and tenants. And since we don't really do property management, I'm focusing only on the stuff that we're going to be really using most of the time, which is the things that have to do with buying and selling. So before I share my screen and jump into it, does anybody have any questions? No? All right. Then let's get started. And we're going to go over here and share. And we're going to do this. Okay. All right. So you guys should be right now looking at the assignment of agreement addendum. Okay. So on the assignment of agreement addendum, now just quickly as I go through each of these forms, we're going to talk about it briefly, what it's there for, why you would use it. Okay. So in this case, the assignment of agreement addendum would be if I was going to completely assign a sale, right? If I was a buyer, I had written an offer, I got my offer accepted, and I wanted somebody else to take over that sale, that transaction, to become the buyer, then we would do an assignment of agreement addendum. That's a complete assignment, a total assignment. A partial assignment would be when I was adding somebody to the sale. So for example, I wrote the offer on my own. Turns out halfway through the transaction that I need a co-signer. I'm adding the co-signer. That's a partial assignment, right? So that would be 1A. Now, what they've done is they've changed it. They've added paragraph 1C, which is an other assignment, which is for me to replace at least one, to replace a buyer, but to have at least one of the original buyers still remaining on the transaction. So, for example, I have a partner. My partner and I are purchasing an income property, and he decides he doesn't want to be part of it anymore. So we find a replacement investor to step in. We would do another assignment, which is I am changing my partner out for my new partner. That's it. So they added that. So instead of doing a total assignment, because that's what we used to do, like there was only the option of partial and total, right? So partial was adding a buyer, total assignment was deleting a buyer or replacing all of the buyers. But we used to have to do a total assignment when we were just removing one purchaser, one borrower, one purchaser, or two, right? But leaving one on, we would have to do a grander total assignment. So they've added in the verbiage now for other assignment, which is just to replace a buyer as long as one or more of the original buyers are staying on. Okay. Questions about assignment of agreement addendum? Is this a document that could be used for a wholesale transaction? Yeah, I suppose you could. The problem is that I think that, agents like to throw around that wholesale, that wholesale word when they're doing their investments. I mean, wholesales is when you're selling like many properties at once in a portfolio. That's technically a wholesale. But yeah, anything that has to do with the escrow where an agreement was done with one buyer and now is switching to another, then yes, you would need the use of this. So yeah, I suppose, yes, you could use it. Any other questions for assignment of agreement addendum before we move on? All right, next up. So, okay, Jesus has a question. Go ahead, Jesus.
Hi, Kyle. Yes, just piggybacking on that question. You could use it, but it's there's a check mark on the bottom that you have to state to the owner that you're getting paid for the assignment. That
Yeah, yeah,
happened to me.
yes. Yeah,
Remember?
yeah, yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean,
Maybe.
we're not getting into the nuts and bolts of the form right now in these forms. We're just going to talk about the changes that were made and how those changes affect you. But yes, in an assignment of agreement, you have to disclose whether or not you're getting paid for that assignment. So, yes, you do have to do
Thank you.
that. All right. So, there used to be one contingency removal form, not any longer. Oh, yeah, I actually opened the wrong form. I wasn't in that order, but it's okay. So, buyer contingency removal now. So now they took the contingency removal and they switched it from to a buyer contingency removal and a seller's contingency removal. So there's two separate forms for that. So this form is only for buyer contingency removal, and the new form is called the CRB. Okay, so instead of the CR contingency removal, there is the CRB. And then for the seller, there is the CRS. So now you have two forms instead of the one. They separated everything. So this is only for buyer contingency removals or for seller contingency removals. Okay, it's very similar to all of the original contingency removals, but they did add that the insurability, so on 2C3, it used to have the insurability of the property was separate. So now it's all buyer's investigations, which means the insurability of the property is now part of the buyer's investigations. It's not a whole separate thing. So what that means for you guys as buyer's agents is that when you're talking with your buyers, they have to make sure that the property and themselves are insurable within whatever time you've negotiated for the buyer investigations. Okay, because if I remove my buyer investigation contingency now, I've also removed my ability for the property to be insurable, right? So if I wait until later on, which some of us do, right? We rely on the lender. We don't do it until we're getting close to qualification, and it's after I've removed all my contingencies, and we find out that the insurance is really, really expensive, or for some reason uninsurable. I'm not protected anymore by my contingencies, like on its own. Now, I can now make a choice and go here to the entire buyer's investigation, except for I can exclude those two things, but now it's an active choice I have to make. If I just remove all contingencies, then that includes the contingency of the insurability of the property. Okay, so you got to keep that in mind for the buyer's contingency. And the seller's contingency form is just, it's only for those specific, sorry, get rid of that guy. It's only for seller contingencies, which is find a replacement property, closing on a replacement property, and any other contingency you may have put into the contract. I don't know what those may have been, but you could have added any contingency. So, questions about the two contingency removals? Anybody? Anybody? No questions? Hey, I like it. We're moving right along, huh? All right. But now this guy doesn't want to close. Let's get rid of him. All right. Next up, we're going to go to the buyer counter offer. So in the buyer counter offer and in the seller counter offer also, in the buyer's counter offer, they've added language in there in 1C about the appraisal gap. So unless otherwise agreed or altered in another counteroffer, if the original offer, the appraisal contingency amount is lower than the original offered price, then the dollar amount of any difference, appraisal gap, shall remain unchanged and be deducted from the final contract price to create the final appraisal contingency amount. For example, if the purchase price in the offer is $1 million and the buyer reduces the appraisal contingency value to $950,000, the appraisal gap is $50,000. If the purchase price is increased to $1.2 million as a result of this counteroffer, the appraisal contingency value shall be adjusted to $1.150, $1,200,000 less the $50,000 if the appraised value below 1.15. Buyer may exercise the appraisal right to cancel this agreement. So what it's saying there is, and I know that I probably should have pulled up a purchase agreement so you guys can see, because we've talked about this before when we're talking about the RPA. In the appraisal contingency, in that section, that paragraph of the RPA, it says the appraisal contingency is subject to the offer price, and then there's a little checkbox that says or, and you write in a price. So what they're saying is, in this case, if we're offering you $1 million, but we're saying all it has to do is appraise for $950, okay, my appraisal gap is $50,000. So that means if I raise the price from 1 million to 1.2, I have to then raise the appraisal value to match that $50,000 gap. It doesn't now become $150,000 gap. Do you understand what I'm saying? And yeah, Joseph, you can't unmute because I made sure nobody could until I unmuted them. So putting up your hand was a good idea. So let me finish this and then I'll unmute you so you can ask a question. So what the contract is now saying is that by default, if you raise the price, right? So if I offer you 1 million and my original appraisal gap was 50,000, if you raise the price, you have to then give me the same appraisal gap, which means my appraised value, in order for me to institute my appraisal contingency and cancel the deal, is now 1.15, not 950. Okay. So if you don't want that to be the case, if you want the appraisal gap to be whatever the appraisal gap is, then you have to address it in the counter. All right. So Joseph, go ahead. You can unmute now.
It was from the last poem. So if I have I forgot the question. Well, it's the if I have, because it's about the contingency. So for a 1031 exchange contingency on the upleg property, if
Okay. So 1031 exchanges, the buyer's intent to exchange, the seller's intent to exchange, those aren't contingencies. Those are just intents to exchange. Those are things that were negotiated as a term of the contract. That's not a contingency. So no, you wouldn't be removing that as on the contingency removal.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any questions about the buyer counteroffer? The seller counteroffer has the same language in it now. Just so you guys could see it, seller's counteroffer has also this appraisal gap language in it. That was the changes to the seller and buyer's counter. Does anybody have any questions about the counter offers, about the appraisal gaps? You can raise your hand and I will allow you to speak. Go ahead, Jesus.
My apologies. I didn't get exactly from the 950. I'm offering $1 million. Now the gap of $50,000, it goes to $1,050,000 appraisal. Is that correct?
Yeah, your appraisal gap has to stay the same if you're increasing the sales price. So if I'm the seller, right, and you make me an offer of $1 million, and I say no, I only am going to take 1.2, and in the original contract, I had said that my appraisal contingency is only subject to the property appraising for a $950,000 price, which says I'm going to pay you $50,000 difference, right? I'm offering you $1 million. As long as it appraises for $950,000, I'm in. I'm still purchasing. I can't use my appraisal contingency. So that means that if it appraises for $950,000 or above, I'm committed, right? So if it appraises at $950,000, I have to pay you $50,000 in order to complete the sale. What it's telling me is that if the seller comes back and doesn't address that gap in any way, but says, I want a higher purchase price, right? I want 1.2. My appraisal contingency doesn't stay at $950,000, which means I have not a $50,000 gap, but now a $250,000 gap, let's say. It raises my appraisal value to 1.15 to keep that $50,000 appraisal gap in place. Okay. Now, if I don't write anything in, if in the purchase agreement, and I think it's, I can't remember paragraph, I can't remember off the top of my head the paragraph. I want to say it's L3 or something like that, or L8. I can't remember. If I don't put a price, I leave it as the default, which is it has to appraise for the offer price, then there is no appraisal gap to address. Okay. So let's see. I don't kind of. What's the purpose? The purpose is really to make sure that people are not. Look, I think what it is that by default people just assume things are going to change, and there was probably a lawsuit. To be honest, There was probably a lawsuit that had to do, and the reason I say that is because these changes that happen to the RPA and to any of the ancillary forms that go along with the RPA, the reason that those changes happen is because there was some kind of litigation because of it. So my assumption is that someone wrote an offer where they put in an amount, right? Maybe the list price, maybe it was a price that they felt comfortable with, saying like, I have $50,000 extra, so as long as I'm protected that I'm only staying at $50,000, I'm in. And they wrote the offer, and the property, they agreed to a higher sales price. The property appraised for less than that sales price, that offer price, and the seller was attempting to force them to pay money that they didn't have, right? I'm guessing that that's somewhere where it came from. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to make it an active step by doing this, that they have to actively say, yes, I'm willing to pay, instead of 50,000, I'm willing to pay 150,000. Because if you make that an active step instead of an assumption, then there is no argument. And I hope that explains, I think, the importance of it, or why they've done it. Next question in the chat is, if you leave the line blank in the RPA regarding the appraisal, then this verbiage doesn't come into play. Correct. It doesn't. It does not. It does not. Okay. All right. Jesus, you still had your hand up. Do you have another question?
No, I don't. Thank you.
Okay.
I will unmute you. I will take it down. Thank you.
Problem. No problem. All right. Let me mute it. Okay. All right. So, any more questions on the counter offers? No more. Okay, let's move on then. I like this. We're moving right along here. Next up is the cancellation of the contract. Okay, so the cancellation of the contract, they didn't change a lot, but what they did is it just said that it added some verbiage about the party canceling the agreement. And what they added in here was the party canceling the agreement, and not the agent, needs to determine if a cancellation right applies. Cancellation must be exercised in good faith and in accordance with the rights and procedures within the agreement, including any applicable notice to perform or demand to close escrow. Section 1 allows for either a one-party cancellation, see paragraph 1A, or for a proposed mutual cancellation when it becomes effective upon a mutual execution of Section 2. So they just added some verbiage in there about that. So if you look at here, it says one-party cancellation, right, is buyer or seller who's canceling, why they're canceling, either per a paragraph of the contract or because one or the other party didn't perform when it came to a notice to perform, or the opposite party failed to close escrow after being given a demand to close escrow, or other, if there's some other reason. The other thing that it added is or there's a proposed mutual cancellation, right? So I could say as seller, I want to cancel, and I'm proposing to the buyer that the buyer is on board with the cancellation. So I send proposed mutual cancellation. Everybody signs it. There is a expiration date now on that cancellation, which means if we do propose cancellation and the other party doesn't sign it, it expires. We'd have to do a new one. Okay, just like any other offer. Now, all this does is cancel the contract, and they added this big, bold verbiage. I mean, it's been there for, I think, since the last revision. Sign in this section solely for cancellation of contract. Proceed to page 2 for disposition of deposit and cancellation of escrow. So it's two separate things on one form. It is me canceling the contract, which we could both agree to, and then the disposition of the deposit, which we may not agree to. Okay, so you have some choices in there, right? You can full release either from the seller to the buyer or the buyer to the seller. The release of a certain amount from the buyer's deposit is to be returned to the buyer. And in most cases, that's really only to be used if I have more money than is allowed to be kept, right? So for example, if I'm purchasing residential units, 1 to 4 units, and I'm going to live in one of them, I have a cap of 3% that I could lose of my money. But that's only if my deposit is 3%. If my initial deposit is only $5,000 or $10,000, but 3% would say be $25,000. The seller doesn't have the right to keep 3%. They only have the right to keep my first initial deposit, the $5,000 or $10,000, whatever I've put in. So if I have, let's say I have put extra money in there for whatever reason, or I've decided to put all my money in because I wanted to be ready when loan docs came in and we have the right to cancel, they don't get to keep everything. They don't get to keep everything. They only get to keep my initial deposit. So if I have $25,000 in there, but my initial deposit was $5,000, then they have to release it. Now, if there's a certain amount of the deposit, like, hey, you guys can have everything but $1,000, then that's what happens here. You're gonna release $1,000 to me, okay, or 5,000, 3,000 of the 5,000, whatever it is. If there isn't a deposit yet, you check that box. Now, with this section up here, C, when we're talking about the release of the deposit, any of those that we agree to, it means the escrow is canceled. It means that the buyer can move on, the seller can go sell it to somebody else, they can do whatever they want. Now, if we go down to D, we can say that the buyer and seller agree to cancel the escrow with the parties and either mutually release each other from the obligation to buy or sell, reserve all rights, retain the obligations right towards each other and under the agreement, except for the obligations applicable to buy, sell, exchange of property. Authorize escrow holder to hold any deposit until receiving subsequent. So this is this is how we choose our rights with, if we don't want to, if we want to preserve our rights. So that's a separate section. Okay. Cancellation of contract. Anybody have any questions? All right. Wait, Patricia says yes. Okay, Patricia, let me find you so I can unmute you and you can ask your question. All right, go ahead.
When would you apply the last section that you just went over?
The last section?
Right, that part, partial release. I don't understand that one.
Okay, so this one would be if there was, let's say there was some kind of a disagreement, right? Like who owes who money or whatever, and we have to decide, like, okay, I want to cancel. Like, let's say the seller wants to cancel and they don't have the right to cancel. And it happens all the time, right? And the buyer says, you know, or let's do this. The buyer wants to cancel and the seller's, okay, I'm fine with the cancellation, but I've already spent X amount of money on a repair that you requested. Okay. I spent $1,000. So I'll cancel, but I want you to leave $1,000 in escrow until we come to an agreement on how much of that $1,000 you owe me. We're still able to move on, but that money still belongs to both of us in escrow. Does that make sense? Right? Like there's a dispute over somebody owing each other money. So instead of just allowing us to cancel and here's the money, we're going to hold the money there that escrow holds on to until we come up with an agreement to say, yeah, we can go our separate ways. I can sell it. You can go buy somewhere else. You don't have to buy this house anymore, but this money is going to stay until we come to an agreement on how much money you owe me or I owe you. Okay. So that's it. I mean, you're not going to use it a lot, but it exists for that reason. Let's see. What happens if you're in escrow and the listing expired? Does that impact the contract in a way? It does not impact the transaction itself. What it does mean, though, is if for some reason that transaction cancels, you're no longer their agent. So you should make sure that if your listing is not going to survive your escrow period, that you should be doing an extension of escrow. But it doesn't affect, like if your listing expires, and even if they list with somebody else after it expires, if this transaction closes, you are still their agent and you still get paid. Let's see. What happens if you're representing a seller and buyer wanted to cancel? So seller signs cancellation of escrow, but now can't get a hold of the buyer anymore because he changes his number or something like that. Well, I mean, in regards to what though? Like they didn't sign everything. I don't know what the problem is. If they didn't sign everything, well, then you have an issue, because if there's any money, it just sits in escrow. And technically your seller can't sell to anybody else. I mean, they just can't close escrow. So that could be an issue. but the buyer can't get their money back until they sign. There's all kinds of stuff that has to do. So I mean, there's some more nuance to that question. Let's see. So basically, in the situation you presented just now, the seller is okay with giving the deposit back minus the cost of the buyer incurred to the seller for a repair before the buyer wanted to cancel. So out of a 10K deposit, the repair was 1,000. The seller wants 1,000 deposit the buyer. Yeah, 9,000 back. Exactly. It's exactly. You got it. Perfect, Derek. All right. Any more questions on the cancellation? No. All right. Next up, we're going to talk about the cancellation of listing. If I can find it. There it is. All right. So what they added in the cancellation of listing is any of the numbered paragraphs can be checked, but both options in paragraph 1 could apply. Okay. So I could now, both of these things could apply. It's not one or the other, meaning I could check the box A and B if prior to the end of the listing period specified in the listing or any extension principles enters into a contract to sell, convey, lease, or otherwise transfer the property, which is what we would say to somebody normally is if they're asking us to cancel listing because they don't want to sell any longer. They're adamant, I'm not selling. Well, if that's the case, then they should have no issue with 1A, right? The other thing is I also can check B, which means that if, let's say that I'm canceling the listing and my listing expires in 30 days, right? So my listing expires in 30 days, and that's what this is talking about. If prior to the end of the listing period specified in the listing, so it expires in 30 days. But on top of that, because of what I put into my contract, right? In my listing contract, I said if 180 days after, if I check this box, if within 180 calendar days of the cancellation, right, enters into the contract to convey, transfer to any person named below those lists of people, right? That exemption list that we've talked about in the listing contract. So both of these things could apply. The exception list for the 180 days, and if they decide to sell to anybody in that next 30 days before my listing expires. Okay. So what they're saying there is now all of this stuff, right? In the event of a transaction specified in ARB, broker has no obligation to represent principal in such transaction. That's talking about the other one. We could always say, no, we don't want to do it. Compensation is payable on close of escrow or if completion of the transaction is prevented by default of the seller, right? So the same things in terms of the listing agreement, but that's what they changed. What they changed was it's not one or the other, it's both. It's both. So both of those things can be put into effect if we're going to cancel the listing. So just remember that when you have the seller talk to you about cancellation, yeah, we're willing to cancel, but this is the terms on what we're going to cancel. We're going to cancel based on if you sell it to anybody before my listing expires and based on the terms that we had already agreed to in the listing agreement, which is if you sell to anybody who saw the property while I had it for 180 days after this cancellation, I step back in as the listing agent. That's fair. That's how it works. If somebody says they don't ever want to sell again, then that shouldn't be an issue for them to agree to that. Okay. Questions about the cancellation of listing? Okay. All right. Next up is exempt seller's disclosure. Where are you? There we are. Exempt seller's disclosure. So remember, the exempt seller's disclosure is used for very specific transactions. They are to be used for any transaction where they don't have to provide you a TDS or SPQ. And the only transactions that exist where they don't have to provide you an SPQ and a TDS are trust sales where the successor trustee did not live in the property, REOs, right, where you're purchasing from an REO from a bank, or probates. Those are the only 3 times that the exempt seller's disclosure is allowed to be used. Every other time, it is a transfer disclosure and SPQ. I don't care if it was an investor that purchased it from an REO and now they're flipping it. they have to provide you with a TDS and an SPQ. Okay, so only three. Transfers, a trust sale where the successor trustee is the seller and did not live in the property, a probate, or an REO. Okay, that's it. Those are the only times you use the exempt seller's disclosure. And what they did is they added some verbiage in here that it's right here. They added this. This property is a duplex, right? If I check this box, this property is a duplex, which means, or a triplex or a fourplex, which means it's multiple units, which is still residential. And this ESD is required for all the units. So now you have a choice. This ESD covers all of the units, and if not, I have to check the box and I have to put what units it's covering, which means I may need now on 2 to 4 units multiple ESDs. And I would suggest you use multiple ESDs if you have separate buildings. Even if you don't have separate buildings, one ESD should be for the inside of one unit and the outside of all of them. And then the other 3, if it was 4 units, would be for the inside of those 4 units. Or you could break it up if they're separate buildings. Unless you can answer all these questions and they make sense for the entire property, go for it. But I would suggest, just to be safe, to do one for each unit, just like we used to do for the SPQ, the TDS, and those things for multiple units. Okay. So now they've added that on the exempt seller's disclosure about specifying that it is units. Okay, somebody says, what about someone that inherited a property that was a rental SFR and sells it? Doesn't matter if it was a rental, unless it was a trust sale where the successor trustee was selling it. Now, if they got it as a trust and they left it in the trust and they're selling it as the successor trustee and it was a rental and they didn't live in it, then yes, this would apply. But if it was their house, so let's say, for example, my grandfather passes away, he had a property that wasn't in a trust, and he gave it to me, right? We did through the process, whatever. He deeded it to me prior to dying. He added me to title, and it's mine now. But my grandfather died, and it was a rental forever. It was his rental. I would still have to do a TDS and an SPQ. Okay, so it doesn't matter. The only way I do the exempt seller's disclosure is if it's a trust sale, a probate sale, or an REO. That's it. Okay. Any other questions about exempt seller's disclosure? No? All right. Moving right along. I like this. All right. Now, this one I wanted to make sure we talked about because, I mean, we are doing more and more of these manufactured homes, right? What they added on here, and it's right here, they added this paragraph 8, that either the buyer or the seller can cancel the agreement if the buyer can't get approved by the park. That didn't used to be in there. That didn't used to be the part of the verbiage. So you can see a buyer's approval of the lease or rental agreement and the contingency is a contingency of the agreement. Within the time specified in the agreement for removal of the investigation of property contingency or 5 days after delivery of the park rules and regulations, whichever occurs last, buyer shall deliver to seller buyer's written approval of park rules and regulations. Buyer shall, within 5 days after acceptance, submit a complete residency application and other required information to park, landlord, or HOA. Buyer obtaining residency approval is a contingency of the agreement in favor of buyer. Such approval shall be obtained within 5 days prior to close of escrow. If approval is not obtained prior to this time, buyer may cancel the agreement. If buyer removes this contingency without first having obtained park approval and the park rejects the buyer's residency application, buyer understands that buyer may be contractually obligated to complete the purchase even though buyer may be required to remove the home from the park. So they added that now. It's a contingency. I have to get approved by the park, and it goes to 5 days prior to close. You can change that. You can adjust that in your counters if that's too late. But we all know we've all dealt with issues with mobile home parks where the buyer does not get approved and it kills deals. So maybe you want to adjust your time periods for that. And again, have a conversation with your buyers and even with the listing agents because this is new. This is only a month or two old. right? That this is new verbiage in there and people may not know it because they don't have a class like this. So have the conversations and make sure everybody's on board and see what the timelines are. If you don't get a counteroffer, at least you know what your timelines are, and you can use notices to perform and things like that to get those things to take action. Questions? Anybody? Hey, look, I'm going to tell you guys something. Mobile homes are not horrible commissions much anymore. They're all, starting to get over $150,000. It's more affordable for some people to buy. I know that the rents are high, but I wouldn't turn my nose up at a mobile home, especially if your production isn't where you want it to be. It's at least something to get you moving and create some momentum. Okay. All right. Let's move on. Next up, where is it? The next thing is purchase agreement, probate addendum. There we go. Probate addendum. What they added there is they added a sentence about the court confirmation required. If you look down here, so right, I've talked with people about these court confirmation things. But now what they added is this little box down here, this little check box, and made it a contingency that if you can't get court confirmation within 60 days or whatever number you put in there after the acceptance of the offer, the buyer has the right to use that contingency to cancel. So they added that in there for probates. And it's good because I talked to an agent the other day that said, oh, we don't want to even get our offer accepted if there's a court confirmation required because we don't want to wait, right? We don't want to have to wait a long time to get a court date. That's the case, then at least by default you have to wait a maximum of 60 days, or you could change it to another number, 45 days, 30 days, but be reasonable. And if they don't get the court confirmation in that time, you could extend it or you could cancel and you can move on. Okay. Real quick, going back, Salvador says it's important to have the park approval than anything. Even if your buyer is a cash offer, without the park approval, you can't close it. Exactly. Yeah, it doesn't matter. That park approval is a big deal. And I think it was good that they added that in as a contingency, right? Because there was so many times where the park had some really crazy approval, like their conditions for people to get approved were ridiculous. So not only is it good for the buyers to be able to move in, but it's bad for the buyers to be able to buy because of those crazy park conditions, but it's horrible for the sellers because it makes it hard for them to be able to sell their property, right? So it's like the parks want to make sure that they're stopping people from selling, right? So again, that park approval, get that process started as early as possible. And especially now with that being an actual contingency of the contract, as opposed to just being something that was part of the investigations, being its own contingency I think is important that we do that as soon as possible. So questions about the probate, pretty straightforward, right? On the probate, it's just giving them a time period that doesn't force the buyer to be locked in forever while we're waiting for courts, puts a little more pressure on the listing agents and their attorneys and the sellers and their attorneys to get things done as soon as possible, but at least it doesn't lock up our buyers forever. Okay. All right. Next up, the listing agreement. And this is just, this added this in paragraph 4 right here, 4C, smart home features. The following smart home features and devices are, right, included in the sale or excluded from the sale. So they just separated them out from the stuff that normal included, excluded, and from the leased or liened items, they made their own thing, smart home features. Okay. Jesus, you have your hand up, so go ahead.
Hi, Kyle.
Yes.
Now, as a listing agent on a probate listing, before, sometimes we couldn't take the listing because it was not really valid because we don't have court confirmation. But now we can utilize this.
No, that's not what that means. That's not what that means.
No,
they're talking about, that's two separate things. The court confirmation that we're talking about here is the court confirming the acceptance of that offer. That's court confirmation. You go to court, you present the offer, they say, okay, this is the price. The part you're talking about happens 45, 60 days before the part we're talking about in that probate agreement. That's not the same thing. That's not the same thing. The appointing of an administrator or an executor is a separate process. That is not court confirmation.
Got it. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Questions about the smart home features. That's the only thing they changed in their listing agreement. So, oh, and they added some contact information in the seller's signature paragraph, but that's it. Any questions about that? Okay. Let's see. Let's still have Jesus' hand up. Yes. Let's lower your hand. All right. Okay. Next up are two rental property disclosures. And I want to show them to you. What they are is they're basically like an SPQ for an owner to give to a tenant. It's a disclosure to give to a tenant. So I know we don't do property management, but we do help owners, landlords to find a tenant, right? We could do lease listing agreements. We could do the process of finding them and represent them in that process, but we just don't collect rents and do things. This is now a disclosure that's going to have to be provided with a residential lease, and it's called, or not with a residential lease. This one is only required if it's not done on a residential lease. It's a management agreement and things like that. That's the disclosure, the questionnaire that you would give. Okay. If you're doing a residential lease, right, where you're going to help them, you do this rental property. Okay. You do this one. Okay. So that they're the same disclosure, they're just two different forms, but they're set up like an SPQ. So just like an SPQ is to provide a tenant and broker with information about known material facts affecting the premises, to help eliminate misunderstandings about the condition of the premises, and where relevant, to document an RPO's response to contractual requirements. RPO is residential property owner. Okay. So it tells you what the purposes of these. The note to the tenants is to give you more information. The awareness for each statement below, the answer is, are you, RPO, residential property owner, aware of? And you say yes or no. So are you aware of lead-based paint? Yes or no? No. Does RPO have any reports or records pertaining to lead-based paint? Yes or no? Do you? Yes or no? Were any renovations of lead-based paint surfaces started or completed? Yes or no? If yes, were such reservations, right? So it's just like the SPQ. And you're going to sit down with your landlord, tenant, and you're going to answer these questions. And that's it. And you're going to provide them to the tenant. So it's just a new form that when we guys do it, I know we don't do a lot of these residential leases where we help them find them, but we do them. This is a new disclosure now that has to be included. Okay. Questions? Any questions before I move on? Because this is something new that we haven't talked about in a contract class before. But the usage of it is exactly like anything we've done before with the SPQ. The two forms are the rental property owner disclosure and the rental property owner questionnaire. Okay. Anything else? Any questions? No? All right. Now, this is another new form. Residential units purchase addendum for use with a commercial purchase agreement or a vacant land purchase agreement. Now, what this is for mixed use. This is for mixed use. Those of you guys that have done mixed use in the past, and I know that that has been some things that have been a little bit more common have been a little bit more common lately, but now we have this addendum to add to a commercials, right? So when we're looking at those mixed use properties, and you guys have had a couple, right? So we have like a storefront and then an apartment above it, or whatever it is, but there's a residential unit. They have a place now to describe what the units are, how many commercial units, how many residential units, and then a description of the residential units, like what they are, right? The top of it is like any other form. It's the property. It's what this is an addendum to, the whole thing. Possession of the residential units, except as specified in 2B, residential units currently occupied by tenants shall be delivered subject to tenant rights upon notice of recordation of close of escrow. Okay. Just like we're just stating, is that Are they going to be delivered with tenants? Or if not, you check the box. Currently, tenant occupied residential units are going to be vacant upon close of escrow. Okay. Vacant residential units shall be delivered vacant upon recordation of close of escrow. So what they're saying is if they're already vacant, they're going to stay vacant. Don't rent them out. Seller occupied residential units and residential units occupied by persons other than tenants shall be delivered on close of escrow upon notice of recordation or at 6 p.m. or subject to attached lease agreement, whatever it is that we're going to do. Okay. Items included or excluded, just like in a listing agreement or a purchase agreement. Additional security for any note in favor of seller for any part of the purchase price, buyer shall execute a UCC1 financing statement. This is just about stuff. Don't worry about that. That's a commercial thing. That's about additional financing that you're going to do. Additional allocation of costs. These are the costs that are going to be split. Okay. Because the commercial purchase agreement doesn't have a reference to these things, items included, excluded, additional cost, it doesn't have it. So this is now adding it for the residential portion of it. The residential tenancy related disclosures, all paragraphs in this agreement addressing tenancy related disclosures, changes during escrow, the security deposits apply with equal force and effect to residential units on the property. Lead disclosures, now you're required to provide the lead disclosures. Anything that would be required in a 1 to 4 unit property disclosure is now required. Right? So it's stating like, hey, I know this was commercial, but you got to do a TDS, an SPQ, a lead-based paint, all the stuff that is required for that residential unit, you have to do it. Talks about what those mandatory disclosures are, the home fire hardening, the Defensible Space Act that we've talked about in the past. A note with this home fire hardening disclosure and the defensible space disclosure. So previously, if you look at the form and you read through that disclosure, you only have to provide that disclosure if in the NHD report it says that it's in a high to very high fire danger zone. But it was not required as the disclosure to say, yes, it's in that area, to provide any kind of inspection report or anything from the city or the county or whoever is the jurisdiction for that, Defensible Space Act, right? Which means I got to cut back some brush and things like that. Lenders are now starting to require that. Okay, so keep in mind that if you're in one of these areas that comes up on your NHD report or that you think may come up as a high fire zone, and you guys know as you get up into the hills and there's a lot of brush and things like that, that it probably is going to be in a high fire zone, I would order my NHD as early as possible on my listing. See if that is a requirement that I have to do this disclosure and advisory, and if that's the case, then start the process of getting a report to have into my transactions, so I don't have to wait for the lender to require it, because it's gonna delay our closings. Okay, so just know that before we weren't required to provide new reports, just disclose. But since lenders are now starting to make it a requirement, and I talked to the TC department about that, and they were telling me that, hey, this is coming up. Lenders are now starting to make it a requirement. It's causing issues with transactions. So let's just be proactive. Okay, just let's be proactive on that. And that's it. This is that addendum. So if you do sell a piece of property where you're writing an offer that is a mixed use, this is how you're going to take care of it. Okay, so let's see. Darwin, go ahead. Unmute.
So from now on, boss, we have to include this addendum in every offer that we submit, residential, commercial, that is mixed from now on.
Mixed use, yes. Yes.
Okay.
Anything that's mixed use, yes.
Okay.
All right, let's see. Next up, we already did that. Solar advisory. Where is that guy? Okay, so the solar advisory added on here a catch-all for any material facts the seller needs to disclose about. So they added this to answer question 6A. They added the 9 right here, any material facts, right? So anything that's not already here, anything that you know about the property. Now, if there's nothing that you know about the property about the solar panels that's going to cause an issue, then your answer is no. That's it, right? But it just added that one question. So you guys do know that any property that you sell that has solar panels, you have to include this as part of your disclosures to the buyer. the solar advisory and questionnaire. Okay, so that's been around since December. We've talked about it a couple times in the past, but please make sure that anytime as listing agent that you are selling one of these properties, that you're providing this solar disclosures. Okay. The seller property questionnaire did the same thing as we talked about earlier with the ESD. It just added, wrong form. Let's see, seller property questionnaire. It added this same thing about the duplex, triplex, fourplex, right? So again, just like with the ESD, if this is if this is 2 to 4 units, then we have to check that box and we have to decide, is this for all of units or is this for each individual unit? Okay. That was the only change on the seller's property questionnaire. Seller's purchase of replacement property. Okay. They added 1B on here, and that says, to indicate that seller has already entered in a contract to acquire a property and then contingency for finding replacement property is eliminated. Paragraphs 4 and 5 were added, identify the buyer and seller respective rights to cancel. So 1B now is that I've already found a replacement property. This is only now for me to close escrow. I'm removing, if I check off this, I don't have to be in escrow, but I need to check this now to get the close of replacement property. And then it added this right here about the rights to cancel. That's it on the seller's property. But this is seller's purchase replacement property is the same basically as it has been for quite a while there. The TDS. No, we're not going to do that. This one. The tenant occupier. Oh, go ahead, Joseph. Hold on. Let me. Joseph, you first, then I'll get to Jesus.
Oh, so I don't know if I did that on my last offer. So it's 1A or B and C if you wanted to be on the close of escrow.
Yeah. If it's okay, so let me see. Do I hold on? Yeah, I got there. So come on, you. So seller's purchase replacement property, 1A is defaulted. You only check off B if you've already entered in.
Okay. So B and C would be only the close.
No. Yeah, no. If you've already entered into so if I sell my house and I've already entered into a contract to buy my replacement property, then I would do B and C. If I've only put my property on the market and now I'm writing a property writing an offer, then I would leave it as A and only check off C.
Okay.
And then Patricia did write in the comments, is 17 days enough in this time? Probably not. I would say probably you're looking more at like at 21 days or 30 days. So, keep that in mind.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And Jesus, go ahead.
Really quick, just as a comment, what made him change so many forms at the same time?
I'm sorry?
As a comment, why the DRE decided to change so many forms at the same time?
This is not even this is maybe 25% of the forms that they changed, but all of the changes that they make always come in January and December. And they changed those because of something happening. There was a lawsuit, plain and simple. All of these things that we've talked about today were changed because there was litigation in regards to the verbiage that they put in there. And some of these things are just minor things that they put in, not stuff that is going to be, but just references to things that have been issues. And I'm sure that there's been a lot of phone calls to the legal hotline about these issues. And even if it didn't end up as a lawsuit, legal keeps track of the issues that they've had. And I'm sure that they go back to the standard forms committee and say, hey guys, we've got to clarify because we've gotten, 100 calls about this issue. I'm sure that's part of it too. So to try to avoid those lawsuits, but generally it comes out of a lawsuit. Okay. That's it. Okay. So where were we? We were looking at the tenant occupied. Yeah, go ahead, Joseph.
Sorry, because I was looking at my offer that I wrote, and before it separated it, right, where the close of escrow wasn't on wasn't on the, but now it's like kind of all together in one, correct?
Huh?
So the last,
You know what? But let's all you and I after class
Yeah,
will
yeah, yeah.
look at yours, okay?
Perfect,
Because
perfect.
it gets
Yeah.
confusing when you're
Yep,
trying
yep.
to explain something without seeing it.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Okay. So let's look at this is the last one. This is it, and then we'll be done and we'll move on to something new. So they added in this. So you guys know this tenant occupied property addendum is required. Okay, is required for any property that you use a residential purchase agreement that has tenants, right? Whether it's a single family or it's 3 units or 4 units or whatever, right? For use when selling tenant occupied 1 to 4 unit properties. I have to provide this tenant occupied property addendum whether the tenant is staying in possession after close or we're going to vacate. I have to include this no matter what. It's required. Okay. It talks about it. Here it is. By default, the tenants are going to remain in possession or the property is going to be delivered vacant. I have to check that box, but it needs to be included in every one of my offers that has to deal with tenants. Okay. We'll talk about this another time. We're not going to get back. This is offers. This is included in offers. But they added language in here that the seller is now required to, within 5 days prior to close of escrow, seller shall deliver to buyer the names of all adult occupants residing in the property other than the seller that are known to the seller. Or check the box, the following are the names of all adult occupants other than the seller that are known to the seller. So I can either tell them now in the beginning, or I have by 5 days prior to close, I am required to provide all the names of all the adults that live in whatever 1 to 4 units we are renting out. If the seller doesn't give me that list within 5 days prior to close of escrow, I can send them a notice to perform. And if they don't do it, I can cancel even if I've removed all my contingencies. Okay, so they've added basically another contractual obligation for the seller that they've got to perform on. So you guys have to understand these things when we're working with sellers that are selling properties with tenants. It's not just you take the tenant and I wash my hands. There's now some things that they have to take care of. Okay. All right. So that was the last form that we were going to talk about. There were more forms, but like I said, most of those were really more about property management and things that we don't deal with. So I wanted to just make sure that you guys were well aware of the items that you're going to see more often than not. So before I let you guys go, any questions at all? Anybody? No? All right. Terrific. Again, this is going to be up on YouTube probably later today. If you missed any of it or you just want to go back and refer to it, you guys can watch that video there. And yeah, Joseph.
If they don't include that addendum, do you have to counter back and add that addendum as a seller?
Yes.
Thank you.
Or you fill it out the right way, and in your counter, you attach it to your counter. Perfect. And you have them sign it. Always. Yeah, always. That's you want them to write their offer correctly, but we can't count on them to always do that. So you do it. Okay. All right. Any other questions from anybody? No. Hey, thank you guys for being here. I'm glad that you all made it to the class. Hopefully you got something great out of it. Oh, Arnold is now late to the party. What's going on, Arnold? Hold on. You should be able to unmute now. Go ahead. Yeah.
Regarding the seller exemption, if the seller is incapacitated or becomes incapacitated, are they exempt from the disclosure?
That's tough. You could say yes because the actual person is, but the property is still not a trust. It would be if you're selling it and they're incapacitated and it's not in a trust, right? So it's the successor trustee selling it, then you'd have to go through the legal process of putting in a conservatorship. And then you probably could use the exempt seller's disclosure, but any other way, they got to try to answer as best they can.
Okay. It is in a trust. And
If it's a trust and the successor trustee is the one who's now taking over because the seller was incapacitated, as long as that successor trustee didn't live in the property, they're not required to do the TDS and SPQ. If they did, if that was their residence, then they're the same as the normal seller. They got to answer all the questions.
And second part to that question, if that trustee or executor hasn't lived there since they were younger,
it doesn't. Then they're not required.
Not required.
Only if it is currently their principal residence are they required to answer the same questions as the seller that they're now representing.
Okay, perfect.
That's it.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right. Anybody else before I let you go? All right, guys. Thank you so much. Again, this will be on YouTube later, so you guys can take a look at it. I appreciate you guys all so much for listening to me ramble on about these forums. Have a great day, and I will talk to you again soon. Bye.